We've travelled around the sun. We've done our washing.
Yeah.
We've put the same clothes back on.
Yes, and the same jewellery.
We're back and we're ready to talk about another component of the Young Vic's play of The Second Woman, starring Ruth Wilson, our favourite woman.
Yeah.
And today we're talking about courage.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a weird one when it comes to the subject matter, because, you know, what was your kind of thinking around why courage was important in the context of this play, but also in kind of life?
I've just got tingles actually straight away, because the first thing I think is the courage of Nat Randall and Anna Breckon to write this play and produce it and star in it in Australia, in a couple of places in Australia, and then I think it went to New York, and then it came to London where Ruth Wilson was in it. So the first time I was queuing up to go in, I happened to be around some Australians in the queue. They were immediately behind me, and they were friends of Nat Randall and family members of Nat Randall and Anna Breckon. So I got a little bit of inside knowledge. And then, not by design, I ended up sitting next to them in that first run that I saw in the theatre. And I absolutely admire those two Australian women for putting together such a brave script and production. The concept of having a 7-minute script on repeat 100 times in a 24-hour period, I think is incredibly brave, courageous.
Yeah, no one's done that. And
then to have the topic of feminism at the core of that, and to have a single woman do that for 24 hours inside a cube that was her space, with 100 different people coming in and out and not knowing who the next one was coming up behind you, is incredibly courageous. To even to think about that and make that happen and be that, you know, I can't remember whether it was Nat Randall or Anna Breckon who was Virginia in Australia.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So one of them played Virginia, and then and also in New York, I think. Hello.
Oh, twist!
This is Tristan. He's come to join us.
He heard us talking about the play, and he was like, he's got some thoughts.
The courage of those two women, I think, should not be ignored. I have a lot of respect for the concept of what they created and made, produced, delivered, taking around the world. But also to acknowledge the courage of Ruth Wilson saying yes to something like this. I mean, my mind still boggles at the thought of saying yes to something like that. And there's a lot that in my day-to-day world where I do feel like I have to draw on courage, particularly in running a business and building a coaching business and putting myself out there, which is, this isn't a comfortable space for me. This is an act of bravery, doing this kind of thing with you in front of cameras.
This has been a really interesting thing to kind of watch you essentially come to terms with as well. You admittedly, you know, you don't really like talking loud. Liz and I have had discussions about the volume of the microphone. Just talking a bit with your full chest. Also putting yourself out, you know, into the world and letting the world see you. I think that for you has been a really big step of bravery to kind of like talk about something you're very passionate about, to come and have a discussion in the context of some creativity, but also in a coaching context with me, which I feel very fortunate for. But how do courage and bravery kind of are they the same word? Do they go hand in hand? Is there any clear-cut differences between them? Because you say courageous, and then I would say, I think it's really brave of Ruth Wilson to go into a queue with God knows who for 7 minutes at a time. And in one of our first episodes, we talked about how one of those instances kind of went awry. Is not...
Yeah, there was a violation.
Yeah, awry is like quite a tepid word for it, but she was really put on the spot, and she didn't know those people, and I would say that
and something happened really without her consent,
and how she can handle that going forward. Like I would say there's courage and bravery. How do we distinguish between the two? So you talk with a lot of admiration for Nat and Anna. Not our good close personal friends, but we wish that they were. Oh God, we wish, yeah. But these are two Australian women who put on a pretty great show, and it travelled the world. And we are two Australian women who just travelled the world to the opposite side. Yeah, as far as London, and then just went, I think I'll be happy here. I think we would both relate to being homebodies.
Yeah. For sure.
I was very fortunate to do a lot of travelling with my dad when I was younger for his work, which I think has really impacted my lust for travel. I would much rather just be happily at home in my flat than I would kind of travelling the globe. I don't think I have a lot of courage or have the same kind of idea of what adventure is for me. As someone else who has travelled around the globe and settled in the big city, the OG Big Smoke, as some of them say, did you find that took a lot of courage, or was it just something that felt like it wasn't an act of courage? It just felt like it was something that you were always going to do, or that you were happy to do?
I was dead scared of relocating to the other side of the world, because I knew I was moving here. It wasn't coming for a bit and see what happens. It was, I'm moving to London, packing up my entire life. What happened in my case was that I asked my mum to come with me, and she did. So we had a holiday. It is cute. That's how much she loves me, So we came and we had a holiday for a few weeks together here in the UK, and then we said goodbye at Heathrow, and she went back to Australia. And I think for both of us, that was the better way of saying goodbye, to say goodbye here, not in Australia. She felt better that she knew that I'd landed, metaphorically and literally, that I had some family to stay with initially, that I would be all right, rather than wondering how I would be when I arrive. And I definitely felt better having her on the plane with me. I mean, I was scared of doing a great big plane journey on my own, and now I think nothing about it, because I've done it so many times on my own. That's
what I would call being scared and doing it anyway.
Yeah, it definitely was.
Yeah. I have heard so much of my own experience in what you have just talked about. The inner knowing of this is where I feel whole, feel like myself, and having the privilege to really know what feeling like your whole self looks like. The real fear of knowing that you're coming to settle, and the courage that takes, it draws from a really interesting part of you that you didn't know existed yet.
If I may talk about age and generation in this context. When, you know, I'm in my mid-40s now. I was a very similar age to where you are now when I
first met me.
Yeah, well, when I moved to London, the age you are now is about what I was when I moved, and I think there's no way I would do what I did then now. So I think that the thing around courage and bravery is what happens as people get older, and losing that sense of adventure, or the risk of losing that sense of adventure that means us to be courageous. And I suppose what I'm also thinking about is that sense of adventure might change. So for me, adventure is about doing something that has a bit of a risk attached to it. And even if you think of a little kid playing in the woods as an adventure, there's some risk about...
You might scrape your knee, you might get lost.
You might get stuck in the mud, it's dark and shadowy and you might not always know. There's sounds that might be a bit scary. So something like going for a walk in the woods as a little person can be scary. And equally, you know, for me, the going into being self-employed at the same time also being an employee is risky because there's so many unknowns, and that it is an adventure. It's a roller coaster. You know, it's a real stereotype about entrepreneurship being a roller coaster. So having the courage to give it a go. So Daisy, I'm curious about your courage to do things, and what are the patterns and the things you know about yourself that help you to be courageous?
It's such an interesting question. It's even more interesting to think about in the context of oneself. I would say that I'm not particularly courageous, although I do a lot of things that people have said, wow, that's really courageous, i.e. like you moving across the world. And you don't think of it as that at the time. I notice myself kind of getting into patterns of comfort a lot of the time. I don't think that I have a lot of capacity to be courageous sometimes. Because I think I'll talk myself out of it. I'll take on someone else's worries. I think there's a lot of things in my life that can very easily point to no and to not try and to not do it.
In the times when you have been courageous, and I can definitely think of a few in the last couple of years, what has motivated you to move into that zone of stretch rather than comfort?
Honestly, safety.
Say more?
Like, I think if there's something really big that I have to face, that at the end of the tunnel, it means that there's like rest and recuperation and peace. Safety is my big motivator and my big push to help me do things that I really don't want to do. I think part of that is a little bit of human condition. In my experience of moving across the world, I was coming to look for a sense of self, which for me felt really safe and authentic. So it kind of hit my values. So I would say anything that really makes me hike up my socks of courage is something that is fulfilling and contributes to the longevity of a safety.
So there's a connection to the outcome that is aligned to your values, I think is what I'm hearing. So the values of being authentic, feeling safe and secure. So being prepared to do something that is scary with that end goal.
Yeah, in the context of the play, to have a character who does the same thing, like a Groundhog Day situation.
And it's a breakup scene.
Can you imagine breaking up with someone 100 times? Oh my god.
I'm flinging noodles at them.
Why don't you just do what everyone does who is a coward like me? Just why don't you wait? No, not even that. Why don't you just wait till things are so bad until they break up with you? That's how it should be. See, if I was really courageous, I would be better at saying I would be better at saying how I feel quicker.
Yeah.
Because I have a lot of really good inner knowing. And I have a lot of really good ignoring skills too for my inner knowing. And I think a real act of courage is being able to say no.
Yeah.
Just as much as it is to say
yes. It's a great point about boundaries that you're raising. You asked me in a previous episode about mental health and well-being, resilience, and how often that comes up in coaching. And I said a lot, most of the time. And boundaries comes up a lot. In my opinion, that is connected to mental health and well-being. And it isn't one of the things I find really striking about the language around mental health and well-being within organisations and looking after their staff and all that kind of stuff. Boundary management is never talked about. Learning how to assert your boundaries, learning to work out what your boundaries are, and then to assert them, to understand what it means to be flexible about those boundaries or rigid about those boundaries, and being careful about both of those things.
Would you say something that you do with your clients is, because something that I know personally I would really benefit from, is the courage to disappoint people.
Yeah.
I really struggle with that. And it's such a shame for me so much of the time, because by not disappointing someone else, I entirely disappoint myself.
Yeah.
It's all about self-growth. That for me is like, that is the context in which I would put courage.
Yeah.
So it's kind of nice to hear you talk about the yes and part of courage. But for me, courage is really not saying yes.
Yeah.
It's looking inwards and it's saying, no, sorry, I can't do that.
Yeah.
Is this something that you have to teach your clients, or help your clients to learn for themselves?
Yeah, I don't teach, but definitely a thing to explore for sure, and probably more in the context of saying yes to themselves as opposed to saying no to other people.
Right. So here's now the human negative bias that the language of the human negative bias.
Yeah.
Instead of saying yes to yourself instead of saying no to others.
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And another part of it is learning to understand what's your stuff and what's someone else's stuff, and not taking on board other people's stuff. That's definitely a theme that comes up time and time again in coaching. And if that has been, and it certainly has been, my pattern of behaviour, which I'm still unlearning, I would argue. But if you've taken on other people's stuff for a very long time, to have the courage to start unlearning that stuff and having the courage to put yourself before other people or other demands or competing priorities, that's a very courageous step.
This is the question of courage. Is courage doing something that no one's ever done before? Is it going on a worldwide adventure? Is it leaving the house one day? Like, what defines courage? And collectively, can we all figure out how much courage we need to say yes to ourselves, or to say yes to stepping out of our comfort zones, or yes to saying that's enough.